Welcome to the Advisors Fuel podcast, where high-performing financial planners and wealth advisors discover proven processes and actionable strategies to elevate their client experience, grow their businesses faster, and achieve unprecedented success. Here's your host, Adam Koch, founder at Adrenaline Advisor Consulting at adrenalineadvisor.com.
Okay, so allow me to introduce for our first ever Adrenaline podcast, a powerhouse in the podcasting studio in Traci DeForge. She's got 3 decades of experience spanning broadcast media and Fortune 500 consulting, and she's the founder of Produce Your Podcast. I'll give you one guess what she does. But they're a premier consulting and production agency that helps businesses just like me, just like you, other financial advisors harness the power of podcasting in their digital marketing strategies. So whether you're a startup, if you're an industry giant like Google or Hilton, Traci's innovative insights have transformed the way companies grow and connect, and she's also the creator of the Podcast Management Academy and co-founder of the Podcast Professionals Association, pioneering education and certification in the industry, which is pretty cool. So you may have heard of her on her own show. She's got the Growth Accelerator podcast or Journey to There. She's a co-host on the Ask Brian radio show in LA. But beyond the mic, she's a member of the Rolling Stone Culture Council, where she leads their podcast member program. And her expertise has been spotlighted by ABC, NBC, CNN, and more. And today, she's here to share her journey, passion, and the secrets behind starting a podcast, keeping the ball rolling. If you're somebody who's been podcasting for a while, how to basically get the thing moving in a way that you're getting more likes, more subscriptions, things like that. So everything from startups to being stuck is what we're going to talk about today. So let's get schooled. And thank you so much for doing this with me again, Traci.
I'm happy to be here, and congratulations on your inaugural episode. That's really important to be. You just got to start, and the first episode's important.
That's actually, you know what? That's a good place to start, actually. So before we were, started recording offline, you and I just did a podcast for one of my other shows that we call Elevate Your Business. And that was a lot more scripted. I had a plan in advance. I didn't have a plan today. I just kind of like this crowd that I'm helping as part of Adrenaline is a bunch of financial advisors around the country. And basically their biggest issues start with being stuck from the standpoint of marketing, having a hard time growing, lead generation, bringing in new business, growing their firms. And then some of it's practice management. Some of it's, having a client service, a matrix, so to speak, a good service model, if you will. But I find myself saying all the time that when people say, well, what's working? What's the one thing that's working? I'll say, there's no one thing. They'll say, well, what are the 3 things then? I'm like, well, it's not 3 things. It's like you start talking about screencasts, podcasts, articles, Google, you're in the middle of doing an audit right now for me. Your company is for one of our podcasts. And it's like, there is so much that goes into it. So just let's just start with the whole, how do you get started understanding that you probably just have to do it, just execute and stop procrastinating. But how do you get over that hump?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question. And really the answer lies in a couple of things that you've already said. So I want to unpack that. When you're looking at a challenge in your business and your challenges are content creation, your challenges are not enough bandwidth to be creating the amount of content that you might like to be creating or is recommended for you to be creating, in lead generation, visibility, more clients, more sales. If those are your challenges, it's not it's really a simple answer is that a podcast can literally solve all of those layers of problems, which can free up your time to then worry about your systems, your matrix, and what to do when those clients come in the door. But it sounds so simple, and I'm not making light of it, but it is so factual that just the idea of starting a podcast will eliminate your challenges around bandwidth for content creation. It'll create opportunity for visibilities. It's a great lead generator with the right call to action. And ultimately, all of that translates into conversions, into clients and referrals and things like that. So where do you start to fix all those challenges is with a podcast. So how do you start a podcast is you really want to start with your why, which is why I mentioned all of those things before, because if those are the challenges that you want to solve, then that's where you begin with the end result for your podcast. You may have noticed when we were talking off the mic, I was asking you very specific questions about your podcast. I was like, Where are you putting the most energy? Where do you want to see the biggest return on your investment for the podcast? Where is your why in this podcast? Because it's the answer lies in the why. So that's what you very first want to do. If you think about if you were having a challenge with your car, you'd want to go to a mechanic and get that problem fixed. If you're having a health issue, you'd want to get a diagnosis. And with your marketing strategy, it's a lot the same. You want to engage with someone who's an expert that can help you build the foundational pieces of the podcast out of the gate so that it's scalable for growth and it's designed to scale the growth of your firm. And I think that's really the most important place to start is with your why and focusing on those foundational pieces initially.
Would you say your why is more about why you're doing the podcast and who you're going after? Is it more about niching? I mean, is there some kind of blend there?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination. I think, it's a bit of a multi-layer answer. So this is why I think it's so important to have conversations like we're having today. I think it's so important to work with a strategist when you're trying to get resolution on these things because it's multifaceted. So the first why, in terms of why are you doing the podcast, really needs to be tied into a business development answer. And if you are going to invest the time and the energy to have a podcast and talk about your subject matter expertise, be a thought leader in the space, then you want to really be able to discern what it is that you want that podcast to do for you. Once you figure out what it is that you want the podcast to do for you in terms of the end game, then back into that with where is the best area for you to show up in terms of your focus? So that could be niching down, right? So it could be, okay, I want to work with I'm better at examples, as you know. So, for example, we produce a podcast called Physicians Family, and the financial advisory firm, they focus on just physicians and they expanded into dentists, but it's still like they are very niche down from not only who their podcast content is generated for, but also to the end client that is going to consume that content. So, if you have that much of a niche in terms of who your ideal client base is, yes, you want to focus your podcast around that. Let's say it's just a certain amount of assets under management that you want to focus on. So then you really want your content to differentiate yourself in terms of if you're going after the people who are just starting to build their nest egg, then that's going to be a different content focus than if you want to go after people that have X amount of millions of dollars that you want to target. How you have that conversation with your listener and with your audience is going to be different. So you want to then really customize the conversation and how you can communicate your expertise in this specific niche so that it translates really well and they have the opportunity to go, hey, yeah, that guy really knows his stuff. I really want to learn more about him and how he works with his clients. And podcasting is just so great for that because you get to, like you do on your shows, you get to share like your head, your heart, your gut, how it aligns, what your investment strategies are, how you've transformed people's lives through your business. And those are engaging stories that people want to learn more and then learn more about you.
What do you say to people who say like, I don't, I'd rather be dead than be caught on stage speaking in front of a person, or I'm worried about sounding unprofessional, or I don't think I'm good on camera and on a microphone. And I see all these people out there and they look all, entertaining and I just don't feel like that's me. What do you say to them?
Well, what I would say is you're not unique and you're not alone, and everybody has those feelings. And even for the professionals like myself who've been on hundreds of stages and thousands of podcasts, if you don't have a little bit of nervousness around it a little bit, then you're not human, right? But we have gone so far. So when we work with the client in the pre-launch strategy, one of the things that we do is we make sure that they have the correct equipment. And if they don't, we have an engineer that works with them to check that out. But I always give the precursor, if you will, and I always warn the clients, I was like, okay, it's all fun and games in the strategy sessions until the equipment arrives. And when the equipment arrives, that's when you start feeling like imposter syndrome. And you're like, what have I done? Oh my God, this is getting real. It happens every single time at some point during the pre-launch strategy. It either happens when the equipment arrives, it happens when the engineer shows up for the sound check, or it happens when they're getting ready to record their first episode. So I just go ahead and warn people from the start. It's normal. You're going to be great. And then also, I think your question is important, and I want to really honor that because not everyone is going to be uber comfortable behind the mic like you and I are. So when we're working together, we want to create a podcast that you're going to thrive in, that's going to be sustainable for you. I think one of the biggest things that people miss, I'm going to start a podcast, and then they order a microphone and they're like, I just need to know what kind of microphone to order and I'm fine. And it's like, the microphone is an important decision, but it's not the most important decision. The most important decision is how can we set up a show for you that's going to be sustainable, that you're going to enjoy, have fun doing, you're going to show up for, because consistency, like financial investments, compound over time. So you got to start out with a podcast that feels good to you and works for you. So that's another part of the launch process, is that if you were saying, well, I have to talk about this because this is what everybody says I have to talk about, but it doesn't feel good to you, it's never going to work. You are going to feel that imposter syndrome. So you have to energetically, I don't use a lot of sports metaphors, but this one I really like is you have to skate where the puck is. So you have to energetically follow a conversation and content and put content out there that you love to talk about. Because even if you're the biggest introvert in the world, if it's something you feel comfortable talking about, you're going to shine and that energy is going to come through.
I like to tell financial advisors that you don't have to be entertaining, you don't have to be on stage. You just have to enjoy those moments when you're face to face with a client at the conference table, teaching them.
Yes.
Because you don't, if you get rid of all the entertainment stuff and all the inflection of voice and me using my hands and enjoying this probably way too much, if you get rid of all that, all the podcasting is literally replicating the meetings you have throughout your week and taking those lessons that you're teaching people and teaching it to everybody and being
Yes.
the teacher. So I feel like you don't have to be, a super extrovert.
Right. And I think what you said too is so important to focus on, because what you're saying is one of the critical reasons why podcasting is so successful for people who own financial firms and do financial investing is because there's certain things that people are intimidated by. They're intimidated to pick up the phone and call doctors. They're intimidated to pick up the phone and call lawyers. And they're intimidated to pick up the phone and call financial advisors. Why? Because people either feel like that they don't know enough, or they're going to look silly, or they haven't planned well enough. There's going to be some shame involved. Like people's money story is a powerful driver. And so the idea of seeking advisors and consultants and insight on getting behind the curtain of your financial state of being can be very intimidating for people, right? So if you are a financial advisor and you host a podcast and you are comfortable in the conversation that you're having, you are warm, you're likable, you're trustworthy, you're all these things that if I'm listening to you or I'm watching you on your podcast, I already have a lot of my barriers of friction minimized because I already feel like I know you. I already feel like I like you. I already feel like I trust you. So I'm going to be more willing to kind of be open to my vulnerabilities around my money story or share what's going on with me because I've already experienced you as a human before I've experienced you as a financial advisor. And the podcast gives you the opportunity to experience the listeners to experience you as both.
Yep.
And that's why it's such a powerful vehicle to drive lead generation and client acquisition, because you're already showing up for them before they even know they need someone to show up for them. And that says so much about the trust and credibility, which is why referral-based business has always worked so well for financial advisors, because referrals and networking are so important, but they're one-on-one and they're hard to scale. A podcast gives you that same likability and the credibility factor, but you can scale it.
And probably the biggest reason I started Adrenaline, it started with helping a friend in the business and spending 27 hours on Zoom in 16 weeks. And, the results were just phenomenal. And I had so much fun doing it. I thought, well, I should teach other people. But the reason I started it, really, if you boil it down to kind of like the precipice of what people, just advisors, financial advisors struggle with, it's the whole, if I could just get people in the door, then they'll like me. Just like what you were saying, exactly what you were saying. They'll like me. I'm good at explaining complex situations and investments and financial planning tactics. I'm good at explaining those things and making them simple. So if I can just get them in here, like I know that they'll hire me, but I just can't get them in here. And so the irony with podcasting is you're basically showing people what you do every day, all day long, what you teach, what the strategies, the solutions you provide, and you get to put it on camera for 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it is you choose to do. You can do it by yourself. You can have somebody interview you. You can interview someone else, but you get to basically put that out there, and it lives there forever too. It doesn't happen once, right?
Right. Well, and you also mentioned something that's a strategy that we're seeing very successful, that's being used very successfully in the financial advisory market right now with podcasts, is this idea of you laid out a couple of different options of interviewing people or doing having the podcast be hosted by just yourself. And one of the things that we're really recommending, because we're seeing so much success in it, is that combination of doing both. So having that interview, that guest opportunity where you can bring in a guest in your network. Maybe it is a CPA, maybe it's an attorney, maybe it's somebody that's a complement to the business that you already run, but it's providing information on tax law, or it's providing information on what to do if you're going through a divorce and how that's going to affect uh, your financial stability or instability, right? So you have this opportunity to widen the range of education that you can provide to potential new clients. But then a solo episode really allows you to go in even more into a deeper dive about what it is that you would recommend. So let's say, as an example, maybe you were interviewing someone who is a divorce attorney, and so they're recommending different strategies of what you're going through if you're actually going through the divorce. And then as a short form episode, you as the host can then say, okay, here are some of the suggestions that were made, and here's how this rolls out into real life over time. If you didn't make these decisions, you might be up against these challenges. If you did take these suggestions, then these are the things that you can expect. And it just gives you an opportunity to showcase your skill set a little bit deeper than it can if you're just doing a Q&A interview like you and I are doing right now. So I love that combination of both. And the two don't have to be connected to the same topic, but when they are, it works really well too. So
That's interesting. Yeah, I actually hadn't thought of doing that. I just, what we do is we take a podcast and we chop it up into short form content using, software and AI. And then we'll usually write an article about whatever we wrote the podcast about. And then there'll be a webinar that same month. So we have themes, like an editorial calendar.
absolutely.
But I never thought about intentionally creating smaller, not like shorts or reels or TikToks, but maybe something that's 4 minutes long or 5 minutes long that kind of corresponds with the longer lesson that can drive people back to that lesson, I guess.
It does, and it's a good audience building strategy too, because what we find is that as people are looking through the feed, either on Apple or Spotify or on YouTube, if you're doing video, is that a lot of times they might see 6 to 8 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, and they might be willing to invest that amount of time if they don't know you or they're just discovering you based on keyword search and things like that. And then once you've bought their trust on a smaller increment of time, then they will convert back to the longer form. And if you use that strategy we talked about, like let's say it's on a tax law scenario, right? So you interview a CPA, but then you want to do a deeper dive specifically just for entrepreneurs, because the tax world for an entrepreneur may be completely different than it's somebody who's getting, a W-2 versus maybe like a 1099 or an LLC or an S Corp or all of those things, or even the LLC filing as an S Corp, right? So you could interview the CPA as your guest longer form, and then you could do even like multiple short episode series that focus LLC, S Corp, focus on Roth IRAs, focus on. So you have this ability to really deliver deeper content, but also each one of those layers is a trust builder for you and your potential new client.
That's a good point. Yeah. And earlier you were talking about, just because I want to kind of go back to the beginning just so we don't forget this, but you mentioned equipment and people go out and they buy a microphone and then it shows up and it's like, oh man, now I'm supposed to do this thing.
Now it's getting real.
This right here is a Yeti Blue USB mic that costs $100 on Amazon. And probably right now with Christmas, there's probably $70 deals going on right now. At home, in my home office, I've got a music studio in the basement. So I've got like $500 Shure microphones.
Yeah.
I don't think everybody needs all that. I think this thing works just fine. I think it sounds okay. What do you think about camera equipment? Mike, I know that that's kind of commoditized at this point. They can Google it, chat GPT it and find there. But do you have any kind of tips on what to use, what not to use?
Well, I do really from where you're starting to where you're growing. And so what we like to recommend is there's a microphone. It's an Audio Technica 2100. And I actually think it's less expensive than the Blue Yeti, but it's actually a little bit better quality.
Hmm.
But what we love about the Audio Technica is that it comes with a USB plug-in as well as an XLR cable
Huh.
plug-in. So as you're starting out, you may only want to invest in the USB that could plug directly into your laptop, or if you're traveling a good bit, a USB microphone is a good portability microphone. But as you start to evolve, you really want to think about an audio interface box. And so an audio interface box, the one that we always recommend is a Scarlett Focusrite
Hmm.
2i2. All of this is available on Amazon. I'm sure you'll probably put it in show note links to the show notes. But the Audio Technica gives you that opportunity to grow with your podcast journey. You can start with the USB if you're not ready to invest in the audio interface box, which is about a couple $100. It's not a huge investment. But once you're ready to up level, then you don't have to buy a new mic to accommodate the interface box because you have that XLR in use. You know how like it's frustrating every time you get an iPhone, they change the charger. So then you have to get a new charger. Like we're trying to avoid any friction, right? So the Audio Technica into the Scarlett Focus 2i2, and then that's going to give you the best quality audio capture. And quite honestly, if you're using a Mac, the camera on the Macs are really good. I mean, the Logitech web cameras are certainly good and they can up level you to a degree. But if you're just trying to keep things simple, your lighting is actually more important than your camera in some cases because you could have a great camera and horrible lighting and it's nothing that's going to solve that. In fact, we have a partner in the UK that we work with that supports our clients in SEO. And they always record because the UK hours are different. And so we sent them ring light, we sent them microphone, we sent them audio interface box for them to record some videos for SEO. And it was still dark. So it was like, we might as well not even send it to them, right? So that just goes to show you, it's like you have to think about variables that are within your control. And you also have to be mindful of variables that aren't in your control and just plan the best for that. And one other thing I'd like to say to people who are listening is like, it's 90% of the challenges that you face as a host are not going to be about your equipment. 90% of the challenges you're going to face, and you can back me up on this if you like or challenge me if you don't, is the challenges you're going to face with your guest.
Huh.
Because you're going to show up with a good microphone, you're going to show up with a good camera, ideally, and a ring light, and you're going to be ready to go. And your guest, like, we have heard some crazy situations. Most of our clients record with an engineer supporting them virtually in the studios for this reason, because they can help navigate any of these issues. We've had people show up for a video podcast that just came out of the a gym on a rooftop building thinking it was an audio podcast and it was a video podcast
Sweat.
and people sitting on park benches thinking that would be an okay place to record an episode. And it's over a decade of doing this, I have stories that go on. And it's never usually our clients that have the technical issues. It's usually their guests that we have to navigate, which is why it's nice to have the support of an engineer if that's something you can do. But it's always going to be something, and you just have to have patience and tolerance and try to navigate through it as much as possible. But I've recorded with you twice now. I think you do a great job.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the first thing I thought when I sat down and like raced in here because I was late is the fact that my desk is really dirty right now, and that's probably not the most professional in the world. But
it's the end of the year when we're recording this, or else you just, no matter the time of the year, you look like a very busy professional. It's all about perspective.
I've got my wife texting me with the, hey, you need to pay this bill for the hospital or clinic or whatever. I'm like, they're here, they're in the stack in the mystery pile,
The mystery pile.
Yeah. So speaking of, I guess struggles, we'll call it.
Yes. Challenges. Yep.
Challenges. I would say that it's yes. I mean, I'm sure you have way more stories than I do, but I mean, I have one people recording a podcast in their car with the camera shining up from the bottom,
Yeah, that's not always a good view of the nostril.
Yeah, being in their kitchen with the light behind them and then using the laptop microphone and you just hear this echo of the kitchen. But what about the things we can control? So what are some of the biggest mistakes that people make that maybe we can help them avoid when they start, embarking on this journey?
It's a really tactical things that you probably don't think about that I'll say, like, so when we send out a guest invite for our hosts and their guest is being booked, we put best practices, which are show up with headphones. Like, even if they're AirPods, like, you really want to have, you really want to have a mic if at all possible. A lot of people now have their own mics because if they don't have their own podcast, they're guesting on other people's podcasts. So we're not finding that to be as big of a challenge as we used to 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. But, having a mic, if at all possible, like we talked about, is not a huge investment. So if you think you're going to be creating content of any kind, whether it's a podcast or guesting on other podcasts or just any type of content, go ahead and invest in a very cost efficient mic and utilize that because the audio capture is going to be better. Some things that are like women, like, don't wear bangle bracelets, don't wear clunky necklaces. We were recording an episode of my podcast, and again, we had an engineer present in the virtual studio, and I was messaging the engineer, like, what is that? Like, I thought there was something going on with the connection that we had, and as it
Jingle
turned out,
bells.
the guest had a clunky necklace, and the mic was hitting it.
Yep.
And and then ice and cups. You never think about it, but like, I always have a bottle of water when I'm recording because I just like, it's kind of a security blanket. I just like to have a bottle of water with me. But don't put ice in cups because if you start moving that cup around, that ice in that cup is going to be distracting. And I think the most important thing of all of these little bits and pieces is, if you're new to podcasting, if you're new to content creation, is to remember that it's very difficult to fix things in post-production. So you want to get it right the first time. And so if you hear an airplane going over and you think that's going to compromise, or the landscaper just starts right when you start recording, then maybe say, I'm going to pause for a minute, let that landscaping finish, or I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to ask you this question, then I'm going to mute myself. You answer it. And so all of those kind of things can be fixed in post. But actually talking over the landscaping, or you can't control ambulances, you can't control, like, those things just happen. But even in Zoom, if you record on Zoom and you have your set, we're getting super granular here, but I think it's important if people are doing it themselves. Zoom allows you to record in 2 audio settings. So you always want to select that to have your audio track be a separate audio track than my audio track, because if the ambulance comes through on my end, it's not going to compromise your audio and it can be fixed on mine, right? So these are just like super granular, like in the weeds kind of tips. But at the end of the day, if you have questions about this type of thing, that's where I think it is you really in determining your why, is where is it important for you to allocate your budget, right? Because if all of this feels overwhelming and sticky and I just don't even want to deal with this, that's where you have full service agencies like myself that can support you in that. But if you feel 100% like you are so confident with your recording, with with everything that you're doing for your podcast, so much so that you now have 3, then you want to make sure you're investing in things like audience growth and putting dollars behind growing your audience and optimizing your YouTube channel and things like that may not be in your comfort zone, right? So that is another multi-layer of discerning your why, is where you're going to allocate your budget so that you can show up the best that you can be.
Speaking to the whole using, recording to Zoom on your computer instead of the cloud, so you get 2 audio tracks. I actually did that right when we started. If you remember, I hit record and I accidentally recorded the cloud. I had to turn that off, turn it on, record to my computer. And to those of you who are listening or watching and you're starting to get overwhelmed, I want to stop for a second, just because if you don't have a big budget and you're concerned about all the money that can be spent on this stuff, it's something to be concerned about if you're really young in the business. Like, if you're a relatively new financial advisor, you're still trying to get clients, and maybe you have the time to learn how to do your own post-production and stuff like that. And I will tell you, because I did it myself, it's not that hard. Whether you're using Zoom and a simple native app on Windows, like Movie Maker on Apple. I used Camtasia for the longest time. Drag and drop it, cut off the ends, fade in, fade out. You can. It's not as difficult as it sounds. However, looking back, I actually did have the budget to pay somebody. I just didn't know there was people out there that would help with things like that. And so I would 100% learn from my mistakes And I would just hire somebody else to do all that for you, where all you do is have somebody in a perfect world on your staff do all the preparation for you, figure out, using ChatGPT for a title, questions, intro. You can use, the bio of if you're interviewing somebody, you can use their bio, their website to have ChatGPT help you with an intro, revise it, of course. But once once that's all done for you in advance, all you do is show up, record, have a good time, and when you're done, ship all the content off to your producer and have them make it sound amazing, because they can take the reason why you want 2 audio tracks is, like Traci was saying, if you've got a siren going off on one side while Traci's answering my question, or I'm at an intersection right here out my window, there's always auto accidents. So there might be an ambulance that comes by, but your producer can just mute your side and they won't hear anything. And you didn't ruin the podcast. It sounds great, super professional. You can EQ it, which again, I'm not expecting you to do that, but so there's plenty of things that you can do to do this on your own. But again, learn from my mistakes, pay somebody, it's worth it. And you can focus on content and showing up and, doing a good job.
Following up with all those leads that you get, right? Too, because
Yeah.
it's like time is money. And so where do you want to allocate your time? And if it's all about the consistency, that's another thing. I spoke about the consistency, but I can't speak about it enough. Is like when you just decide to launch a podcast, the frequency of which you're releasing it is very important to decide. So a lot of times, especially with our financial advisory clients, we'll really look at and say, do you need 4 episodes? You would think from a producer's mentality, we would be like, oh yeah, you got to do every week because, obviously we'd be producing more episodes, but that's not how we look at it. We look at it as what is the most sustainable for you to maintain that's still going to give you enough content and still going to make impact and still going to have people continue the conversation after they've consumed your content. So a lot of times what we find is the one long form and the one short form is very attainable. It's a great place to start out. Then it does possibly leave you a little bit of extra budget to then invest in some audience growth strategies and things like that. And then once that whole momentum catches on, then layer in another long form or layer in 2 more short forms and then continue to grow with that momentum. Because if you can show up consistently, you're going to build your audience. If you start out hot and heavy and you are flash in the pan and you burn out after 8 episodes over 2 months, that's not doing you any favors. And it's certainly not doing your audience any favors because they get accustomed to, they're building a relationship with you as every time you release an episode, you're investing in that relationship with a future or existing client. And it's important for you to be able to continue to make that investment over time. And I think that that's another thing too, is that once you create this content, you were talking about having a team member, someone on your staff support you. That's where it gets really interesting because you can integrate these episodes into newsletters. We have a client right now. It's the Metcalf Money Moments is the name of their show, but they have a Metcalf Money Minute that they put into their newsletter. And so they're repurposing the content. They can take that piece of shorter form content, even getting it down to 60 seconds or 2 minutes or so, and DM that. So like through LinkedIn, you can use it as a lead generation tool by saying, hey, tax season's upon us. I thought you might want to, listen to this episode or hear this short clip or take a couple of minutes and check out why it's important to file as an S Corp if you're an LLC. Like these are just conversation starters that's building your credibility with them as a tool. And I think that's, again, another just super positive way to utilize the content you're already creating.
Yeah, I think that's great. And then I think that sometimes people suffer from that whole analysis paralysis, right? Like how important is, well, let me ask 2 questions. I guess they're completely unrelated, but you mentioned you don't have to do it every week. You don't have to do it bi-weekly. Once a month could be fine if you do shorts. If you had to choose and somebody said to you, I can only do it one of 2 ways, but only one way, either A, a weekly long form podcast, or B, a monthly long form podcast with weekly shorts, which would you recommend? I'm just curious.
Oh, I can answer that really easily because we literally just reframed all of our packages for 2025 to reflect this because we are seeing so much. And I think it's important for our audience to know. So we only work with business focused podcast, meaning that we only produce podcasts for business owners like financial firms, healthcare practitioners, law firms, and who are utilizing their podcasts to grow their businesses. So that's our ideal client. So our recommendation is going to be based on that clientele, which I think is very similar to who Adrenaline's focused on, and that is one long form and 2 short forms per month,
Interesting.
or 2 long forms and then repurposing short form out of those on. So if you have the budget to do 2 long forms and we can repurpose some shorts out of that for alternate weeks, or 1 long form and then 2 independent short episodes. Those are literally the options that we've restructured our packages to support, because we know that that's strong enough. That's gives you a really good volume of content to repurpose, and it leaves some budget left over to invest in growing your audience, which is so important because all the algorithms and all the things on social media have changed so dramatically that organic posts are only getting you so far. And so we take and we look at it just a flat budget per month, and we say you're going to either do 2 long forms or you're going to do 1 long form and 2 short forms, and we're going to invest in growing the audience alongside that so that you're building audience and momentum every month, and you're getting enough content that you can repurpose organically and be able to drive the visibility, the leads, and the sales through that. So that is our strategy. You heard it here first, because we haven't even actually made any formal announcement around that. But I'm saying it so passionately because we restructured our packages because of knowing that that's what's optimal for our clients to make sure they get the most out of their investment. Now, if you want to go above and beyond that, great. Like, we're not going to say no, but only
Sure.
if it's sustainable, right?
Right.
Only if it's sustainable. But if you can't sustain 1 long form and 2 short forms, then you really ought to just really think through your why.
Mhm.
Because, and that's not to say, again, it's a tough question too, because once a month is the absolute minimum you should release. And there are clients who are like, I literally can only get to recording 1 long form, 1 a month. And I'm like, okay, but then when you're in that recording session, we got to capture a short form, even if it's just 5 extra minutes, 8 extra minutes. YouTube loves 10 to 12 minutes is kind of their sweet spot. So if we can get somebody to do 8 to 10 or 10 to 12, that's really good for video, for the algorithms. But mostly, if we can combine that in 1 recording session, they can knock that out. And
Sure.
so that's going to give them the frequency of twice a month. So I hope I wasn't confusing, because there's no really cookie cutter formula, but there is what can work, what can work for you, and what can work for your business. And those 3 all have to line up.
No, I don't think it was confusing. I just think that, I know that people who are watching or listening to this are thinking to themselves, man, this sounds like a lot, and they're like, if I'm going to do this, I want to make sure I've got it teed up and I've got content, and, I know, like, I plan well for it. And then heaven forbid, I put together this thing. I have the content teed up. You do maybe what I do, which I often record 5 or 6 episodes in one day. I just make it podcast day. And that way
Yeah.
as opposed to trying to space it out throughout the week, I feel like that's a whole lot less efficient. But then it's the whole, like you said, if a tree falls in the woods, but there's nobody there, like, did it make any sound? Well, if you make podcasts and nobody listens and nobody subscribes, well, you're going to feel like you wasted your time. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the marketing side of this too, which again, I think most of us, that's not our expertise. Our job is educating clients, teaching them, providing solutions. So one more thing to kind of get started here, when it comes to starting a podcast, how important would you say is the name? The name, the thumbnail, the banner,
Oh
should
my
people
gosh. Well,
overanalyze
so
that?
there's just no easy answer for that. Well, I always give long-winded answers. I'm sure you probably already figured that out by now.
Same here, by the way.
So I'm going to give you a technical answer, and then I'm going to give you a secondary answer. So technically speaking, in Apple's podcast specifically, you can only be discovered by the name of your show and by the author tag, which is typically the host name.
Okay.
So as you are, and this is again why it's really important to work with a professional when you launch your podcast, because we know all these innuendos of how to set up these platforms, how to optimize them, how to get you found in search and discovery organically. But in Apple specifically, the title of your show and the author tag are the two main discovery factors if people are searching for your content. So I'm using that example again of the Metcalf money moment. Well, that's some really good alliteration. It's also, that's the name of their firm. They're based out of Kansas City. They also had some traction around the Money Minute that they were using in their newsletter. So it's basically given them the opportunity to expand their brand and making it more into a podcast longer than a minute. And that served two purposes for them, because if someone was to search for a podcast that Metcalf Financial produces, then their name is in the title and their name, the independent, they were looking for the host. They have three co-hosts together. Then all their names will be in the author tags. So, but then again, you don't want to overload with keywords either. So we also want to make sure, because there are other platforms and ways to search. There's Spotify, there's iHeart, there's YouTube, there's Spotify now has video as well as audio. So your show description is actually very critical to make sure that all the keywords that people would be looking for if they were searching your content are also optimized in your show description, because that's what Google's going to look for. And that's what, so if you go and say podcasts about mortgage lending, and or in the physician's family example, podcasts for physicians' finances, then you're going to want to make sure that you're optimized for that kind of search. So the title is really, really important, but there's a fine line between having it be a keyword overloaded and a good fit for your brand. And that's where you really want to have everything be the continuity. And this is probably a big soapbox moment for me that I get frustrated about, is like when people think of a podcast, they think of it almost, in some cases, it could be an afterthought. Like they've invested so much in their website. They've invested in SEO. They've invested in their visual branding of their business cards, that they're still using them, or just their digital presence, or all of those things. And then they don't connect the dots with their podcast, because your podcast is an extension of your brand. It should be as aesthetically pleasing as your website. It should be as on brand with fonts and colors and things in your cover art as your other brand. Like, it's not a standalone. It's something that really needs to flow and be integrated into the rest of your brand. And so the title should reflect that as well.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the thumbnail and banner on it, like the YouTube banner? Is that all in thought important? Does it need to have you on it?
It is. Or? It is very important. So there are a couple of different ways. Like, we've had financial advisors, for example, Brotman Financial Group, his podcast was Don't Retire, Graduate. And so
that's cool.
He had, in fact, you can actually, if you're watching this on video, you can see the cover art is behind me. If you're listening to it, it's a cover art with the host is a caricature in a cap and gown.
That's cool.
And with a microphone, Don't Retire, Graduate. When we built the show for him, we used the pomp and circumstance, like the graduation music as the open. So we built a brand around his show that wasn't directly connected back to Brotman Financial Group, but he was going to be writing a book. And so he wanted the book and the podcast to be connected. And then it's been quite a successful podcast journey for him, because when he started guesting on other podcasts. Then he started his own podcast. Then he started appearing as a expert in local Baltimore television programming. He's written 2 books. He started a media company as a result of his podcast. So he's really expanded his whole firm just by starting, with the microphone. But that brand, there was vision for that continuity across the board. So it doesn't have to be your picture, but there has to be some sort of likeness, I think. Physicians' Family never used pictures of themselves. They never had guests. So their branding was always just the logo of Physicians' Family, the podcast. And then we had Living a Richer Life by Design as a financial firm that is a podcast that we produced for a firm out of St. Louis. Living a Richer Life by Design had nothing to do with the name of their firm, but it was such a great What they did with a special segment for branding was at the end of every podcast, they asked their host, what does living a richer life by design mean to you? And I love that because
Cool.
everybody's answer was different, but then we were able to take those answers and create montages and like special series around what a richer life means to you. So there's so many fun examples. The creativity is endless. It's just a matter of how you want to communicate your message and do that through your podcast.
Okay. Now, what about once you get started, getting, structuring things in a way that you keep people engaged from start to finish? I know on YouTube analytics, you can go on, you can actually see how long people watch and where they start to drop off. And I think that's really interesting information, right? But it's almost like, what do you do with that? So what's your advice for building content that kind of keeps people listening to the very end?
Well, we have a term that we've coined that we call the structured, unstructured podcast.
Okay.
And what we mean by that is that we will actually create a clock. And my background is broadcast radio. So this is a carryover from when I worked in broadcast radio. But we'll actually define a clock for the host. It'll be just like maybe, for example, it might be open the show, do an industry insight, connect to the topic, and then do a Q&A interview, and then integrate a special segment at the 27. In the special segment, like, is it again what does living a richer life by design mean to you? Is that question that cues to the guest that you're going to wrap up. Then you do your call to action, which we believe in having it be a very important, like a really good warm invite. Like, I'd really love to invite you to sign up for my newsletter or attend my event or go to online and get our series. And then the show wraps. So there's a structure to all of that. But to the listener or to the viewer, it comes across as unstructured in that it's just a really nice flow. But the thing that you really need to pay the most attention to is that people consume content because they want to feel lighter and smarter. So if your podcast has the opportunity that they leave it feeling like they learned something and they felt a little lighter because your energy was good, your guest energies were good, and they can go, we used to call it the water cooler moment, but now it's like the next Zoom moment. If they could leave listening to our conversation today, and they could jump on a Zoom call and they could be like, hey, did you know that that's really important that your name is in the author tag if you want your podcast found on Apple?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they feel lighter and smarter telling that to someone else because they didn't know it. That's the whole key to the success. It keeps people engaged. It keeps people sharing your podcast. It keeps people coming back because the experience they had with you is something that they felt lighter and smarter as a result of the time they invested. And so they want to reinvest more time.
So what about solo casting versus co-hosting versus guest interviews? Do you pick one? Do you combination of all? What to keep it interesting, or does that make it too messy?
Yeah, no, I mean, so this is, again, there's no true formula, but there's just certain structural alignments, if you will. So one of the things we've talked about a lot today has been the short form versus the long form. 90% of the time, what we see is that the short form is a solo episode that's much more tactical, that gives the host the opportunity to really showcase their expertise. And the long form is more of bringing in another expert, having a conversation, having that more of a Q&A like what we're doing today. However, I've seen in one of the financial advisor podcasts that we produce, they actually decided to flip that strategy as we were doing the building the foundation pieces for the show. They decided to flip that strategy, and they decided that they wanted the short form to be the Q&A because they wanted to hit the high notes of, again, coming back to an estate planning lawyer or a tax attorney. They wanted to just hit the highlights of that. They didn't want that to be a really lengthy conversation. And they have multiple co-hosts, so this worked out really well for them. Then they use the long form, and just to give people an idea of what's the difference between short form and long form. And by our definition is if it's up to 15 minutes, so if it's 15 minutes or less, we consider that short form. If it's 30 or 31 to 60, that's a longer form. So it has to, in order to really be qualified as a short form, it's 15 minutes or less, but it's ideally, again, in that 8 to 12-minute range. And that's for YouTube, also just for people's purposes of listening. But they flipped that strategy and they wanted their guests to be in the shorter, kind of hit the high notes, and they wanted more time to dig into their investment strategies and what's going on in the industry and everything that's happening in politics. Like they wanted more time to dig into that and build those relationships and show the dynamics of their firm and show kind of behind the scenes of what's going on and how they're serving their clients. And so that's an interesting way to look at it. So there's no real right or wrong. It's more of a right or a left.
Okay. I like that. More of a right or left. What about you've got it cooking, you've got your content, things are starting to go well, you're feeling pretty good, but then you get disappointed because you're not getting a lot of views and you're not getting a lot of subscribers. What would you say aside from the obvious being hire you and your company to help you do it, right? Now, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek because I think probably that is probably one of the biggest answers is if you really want to ramp up, then pay for marketing and get a little juice injected into the whole strategy. But for in the beginning stages when you're just trying to grow it organically, easy for me to say, just get more downloads, more views, more subscribers. What's the best way to do it organically?
Well, I think first of all, you got to get your mindset right about your metrics. So when you are looking at a lifestyle focused podcast, if you're looking at a Joe Rogan podcast, or you're looking at a Tucker Carlson podcast, or you're looking at a Theo Vaughn podcast, I'm using all masculine hosts for whatever reason. What just came to my mind. But those are going to be appealing to broader audiences by definition. True crime, narrative storytelling, entertainment. David Duchovny does a great podcast called Fail Better. Those are going to be more targeted to larger audiences because a lot of them already had celebrity audiences built in when they started their podcast. But even more importantly, they're talking about subject matters that appeal to a broader spectrum of people in general. When you are doing what we call a business growth focused podcast, which as I mentioned, those are the only types of shows that we work with, those podcasts typically have smaller audiences, but it's quality over quantity. So your metrics and your definition of metrics and what's successful to you really needs to be aligned with your objectives because we produce an executive consultant podcast, and they may not get over 350 downloads per episode, but it only takes a couple of people to convert into their very high ticket coaching program to make a difference.
Sure.
So they're not going for 1 million downloads per episode. They just want the right people to hear their message and take action because they want the right fit. And that's a lot like what is important for financial advisory podcasts, or you're really looking for a specific a clientele with a certain level of assets or a certain type of investment strategy that you're focusing on, or a certain, again, professional niche definition. So you have to get really clear on your metrics and your mindset before you can evaluate.
That's great
So
advice.
then, okay, but nonetheless, you still want to have some metrics, right?
Of course.
So the thing that we always start with first is, okay, how are people discovering your show? Making sure there's no bottlenecks to how people are actually finding your content that they're searching for if they don't already know about you. And then what are the other areas where your podcast is included? Are you sending out a newsletter? Are you DMing it through LinkedIn as lead generation? Are you putting it out on social? Are you repurposing it as blog posts onto your website? Like how efficiently are you using your content creation as a strategy, but also how efficiently are you promoting your podcast? We've seen so many examples of companies and these happens in the larger companies typically, where they create a podcast and it comes under a different department. Crazy. But maybe it comes under internal communications versus marketing. And so marketing doesn't even support the fact that they're doing a podcast, so they disregard it. That's only happened like maybe once or twice in a decade, but everybody needs to be on the same page about your podcast. Like it's a business growth tool. It's a business development tool. So it needs to be included in your business development conversations. It needs to be leveraged in your marketing conversations. It needs to be the center. If you look at a wheel with spokes and hubs, your podcast needs to be the hub, and everything that gets generated and spread out as a result of that needs to drive traffic back to your podcast. And if you're doing that, you're not going to be worrying about your metrics because you're going to be hitting the people you're going to need to be hitting when they are ready to hear your message, and they're going to take action.
That's great advice. I think that helps to kind of diffuse some of those who are really concerned about, the numbers and not, being so popular, so to speak. But what about how important are reviews and ratings, comments, things like that?
Yeah, I love that question too, because it's a lot of times you're going to hear, go to Apple and leave us a 5-star review. We really appreciate it. And yeah, you should appreciate it because it's nice when that happens. But those are going to be more for social proof and proof of concept. We actually recommend that you use any kind of review or any kind of testimonial. So if someone sends you a text message that said, love that episode you did, or if someone sends you an email that was like, I just finished listening to your podcast with Traci about podcasting and I just learned, I learned so much. Those are considered reviews. So grab that text, put it in a graphic. A lot of people use Canva. Create a square graphic, put 5 stars in the graphic, take any of the comments that you got through social, comments on your social, comments on your YouTube, text messages, emails, and use those to fuel your social proof. Because are they going to help you grow your audience on Apple? Maybe, but it's not going to help you grow as much as if your show description's optimized, if your title's optimized, if your episode titles, your episode descriptions are optimized. Those are going to be the things that fuel the algorithms. The reviews are nice. They're nice to have. But I don't know if you've tried to leave a review lately on a podcast, but it's not the most intuitive experience.
No.
It's not the easiest thing to do. And again, you're asking them to do it for you, where your mindset as a host should always be, what can you do for them? And so if you're asking, what can you do for them? You're not asking them to do something for you. And the more you're focused on what's in it for them, the more they're going to be likely to do something for you anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. And because we're focusing on them and because we're trying to educate and because we're trying to do so many things at once here, but we're all such busy people, what do you say to the person who's concerned about maintaining consistency, whatever the schedule is they choose, and cadence, while at the same time, obviously, we're all busy. We're all running companies. We're all, in this case, financial advisors trying to help clients. We've got client meetings. We've got all these other things we're trying to juggle. Are there any tips or secrets to, combating the problem of having a busy schedule?
Well, I think, I'm all about simplicity and like what works for you. Cause I know you can tell me all day long that I need to be a morning person, but I'm never going to be a morning person. It's not going to happen. So I can read all the hacks. I can try all the things. I'm not going to just magically turn into a morning person. So you've got to just honor what works for you. And then based on that, you've got to stick to it. So I like to use the metaphor around a gym membership. If you're a person who joins a gym and actually goes to the gym and like you do it regularly, like more power to you. I think that's freaking great. That's probably how you're going to treat your podcast too. So if you're somebody who is a DIYer for going to the gym and doing that, then you're probably going to be a good DIYer for your podcast. If you're a person who gets better results by having a personal trainer who you have to go to and sign up for and show up for, then you're likely going to do better for your sustaining your consistency over time by having an agency that you work with where you have an engineer who is waiting for you to show up for you to record, because you're likely not going to let that person down. You're likely going to build it into your calendar. You're paying for it, so you want to use it. So I just think you have to follow your own rhythms and your own patterns. You're not going to your podcast is not going to reinvent the person that you are. So you need to embrace the person that you are and make those habits work within how you work, because everybody has the same amount of 24 hours, and how everyone uses their 24 hours is what makes them different. So if you can find 1 hour a month, which is really literally all the strategies that we've talked about today can be accomplished in 1 hour a month in terms of showing up and recording. Yes, you would like to have some support helping you get guests and doing some other things behind the scenes, but you're going to need that help for an administrative assistant, for other marketing initiatives anyway. No one's going to show up and do your podcast better than you. So just find 1 hour a month, have it be the first Thursday of every month at 10 a.m., schedule it like you would a personal trainer at the gym, and show up. And that is all you really have to do. And the rest can be taken care of for you, or you can layer in what parts you want to invest in, what parts you want to participate in, what parts that you want to do to grow your show. But at the minimum, you can be a successful podcaster by doing that.
I think that that was a great way to kind of highlight what you do at produceyourpodcast.com, because just again, to the people who are financial advisors by nature, I think we're a little cheap. we're providing some financial solutions, right? We're supposed to be saving
Right.
people
Well, you're
money.
telling people to save money, right?
We're trying to save money
But
here.
you're
So
also respect the value of time and money too.
for
So
sure. Well, that's what I was just going to say, actually, is that for those of you who are sitting here going, okay, that's fine, but 1 hour a month, come on. I mean, prepping, getting a PowerPoint ready if that's necessary, finding, the right software, getting it set up, the post-production. It's like, if you want to do that yourself, again, in the beginning, I think it's okay. But let's just say, I'm just going to, because I've been there. Let's just say you get through the learning curve and you learn how to do it all. Let's leave that out of it. Once you've been through the learning curve, it's going to be a whole lot more than an hour a month. But that's my point, isn't to discourage. Rather, my point is to say, if all it takes is 1 hour per month to record something and turn it into those 3 pieces of material that you were talking about earlier, as opposed to spending what, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of your time doing all the other stuff, what are you worth per hour? What is your company?
exactly.
Divide your company, your total company's revenue, divide it by 52 weeks, divided by 5 days, in those weeks, the 40, if you want to say 40 hours a week, figure out what your hourly rate is, but cut out all the vacation time, cut all that stuff and see what's your hourly rate. And like, is it worth for you to be doing that? So here's I guess my question is, at produceyourpodcast.com, what's the experience like? If somebody hires you, what do they go through? What's that experience look like?
Yeah, so it is definitely 100% white glove focused in terms of the journey from start to finish. So when you come into our portfolio of services, if you're starting a podcast, we do, and I say we, I mean me, because I do all of our pre-launch strategy sessions. That's one of my most favorite things, is to actually help you build the show through your business development strategy, the format of the show, how it's going to look, how it's going to sound, how it's going to feel, and then the marketing and distribution aspect and how to monetize it if you want to bring in sponsorship. So we spend, and in this case, it would be 3 1-hour sessions, but we would spend 3 hours together, typically 1 week apart. So over the course of 30 days, we would spend 3 hours total together developing the strategy, which then we create a blueprint is created for you. And during that strategy session, you're going to see things like, we're going to do competitive rankings for other types of podcasts in your space. We're going to do keyword research to show like how your title is going to show up among your competitors. Like it's so much a comprehensive 360 degree. We're going to look at the business development model, how you can integrate the special segments. We're going to build that into a blueprint for you. Then the blueprint is the architectural plan for how we're going to build the show. So we're going to pull music beds for you to listen to. We're going to pull voiceovers for you to listen to. We're going to design the cover art. We're going to do all of the things, make sure the show description is written correctly, all the things we talked about, getting you launched properly on all the platforms. And then we're going to build an audio trailer, a video trailer. The first 3 episodes, we're going to get you up and launched with these episodes. And then we have what's called cadence mode. So once you're through that discovery and launch, which is a full experience, happens over the course of 60 to 75 days, then you go into cadence mode. So you have a dedicated client manager and a dedicated engineer that's going to make sure that you're showing up on time, that's going to support you in all the heavy lifting. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway, is that our processes, our workflow, our systems were designed for busy executives because I built them for myself first. I started my first podcast and I was like, I'm never going to be able to keep up with all this in the way that I want it to be and as professionally as I want it to be done. And in 2015, when I launched mine, there were less than 350,000 total podcasts, and there were no full service agencies at that time doing the level and the degree of full service that we offer. So I built one.
Yeah.
and
Turnkey.
so
Sounds pretty turnkey.
yeah, it's 100% turnkey. And then you can extend beyond that into things like growth services, sponsorship services, all the other things go into that framework. But the most important thing is that we focus on it being simple and easy for you so that you're having fun. Because if you're not having fun, you're not going to keep doing it.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's got to be, I think that's where, not to, end with the beginning in mind here, but that when you were talking about your why, I think that's so important. We talk about with Elevate, helping other advisors help their clients and save them from bad advice and bad advisors, and living by that fiduciary law, and doing what's in our client's best interests, even if it means making less money for the firm. And there's so many great financial advisors out there, And I think like the barrier to entry for them anyway is just getting those people in the door so they can go save those clients from that bad advice and those bad advisors. So I think that this has been a great episode. It's a great first ever episode for Adrenaline. So thank you so much for doing this. If any of you want to check out Traci, you can find her on LinkedIn. You can find her, like I said earlier, at produceyourpodcast.com. They've got a lot of great free stuff there too. Blog posts, case studies, examples of how things work in a real show. You'll also find all her contact information, a bunch of stuff in the show notes below. And as I always say on every episode we've ever done for any of our podcasts, there's thousands. There is no shortage of podcasts out there. So you chose to give ours a listen today. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Advisors Fuel podcast. For more articles, videos, and resources, or to schedule an intro call, visit adrenalineadvisor.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for financial or legal advice. Always talk to your compliance department before implementing any of the ideas shared in this episode.